Olivia Carter stepped into the courtroom with an air of quiet confidence, her movements measured and deliberate. She had been in rooms like this before, but never under these circumstances. Today, she was facing a minor traffic issue, the kind of thing most people would shrug off, but Olivia wasn't like most people. Her presence alone felt out of place in the small-town courtroom with its worn wooden benches and dusty air, the walls lined with shelves holding forgotten law books and case files. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here to demand special treatment. Either she simply wanted to resolve the matter and move on, but something about the situation made her feel the weight of every eye in the room. She could sense the judge watching her, already sizing her up, his eyes scanning her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. Judge Samuel Turner was a man known for his stern demeanor, his unyielding adherence to the letter of the law. But more than that, he was a man of assumptions. He had spent years in the courtroom, making quick judgments based on appearances. Sometimes it worked to his advantage, other times it didn't. But today, he was certain of one thing: the woman standing before him was not a threat, not someone who would challenge the law or him in any significant way. And so he leaned back in his chair, the gavel resting lightly in his hand. As he waited for the proceedings to begin, he couldn't know how much the day was about to change for him. The room quieted as the bailiff called her name, Olivia Carter. She stood up without hesitation, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her eyes meeting the judge's with a calm steadiness that almost seemed out of place. Given the circumstances, she wasn't afraid, not like the others who had stood here before, their voices quivering with nerves, their words stumbling over themselves. No, Olivia was different. She wasn't here to beg for mercy. She wasn't here to explain herself. She simply knew this was a minor infraction and that she would move past it. Like everything else in her life, she had always dealt with obstacles with grace and quiet strength. Judge Turner studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing as he adjusted his glasses. Her clothing was simple but elegant, a tailored blazer and slacks, nothing overly flashy, but there was something about her demeanor that made him pause. She didn't look like someone who would get caught in a small-town traffic violation. But then again, he thought, maybe that was just the point. Maybe she was the kind of person who thought the rules didn't apply to her. Maybe she thought she could get away with anything just because of her apparent wealth or status. He had seen people like her before, people who thought they were above it all. He cleared his throat and spoke her name again, Olivia Carter. He read off the charge: a traffic violation, a simple mistake. He told her in a tone that carried more judgment than he intended. But he didn't care. This was his courtroom, his rules, and if she wasn't going to show the proper respect for the process, then she would learn that there were consequences. Olivia nodded politely, acknowledging his words, but she didn't speak, not yet. She was waiting for him to finish. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle these situations was with patience. She would deal with this the same way she dealt with everything else, quietly and efficiently, just another challenge to face head-on. Judge Turner's eyes never left Olivia as he continued reading the charge, the words leaving his mouth like a scripted monologue. But his mind was somewhere else, trying to figure out why she seemed so composed, so unbothered by the situation. Most people would have protested by now, offered some sort of excuse, but Olivia didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her posture perfect, not an inch of uncertainty in her mannerisms. She was unlike anyone he had encountered in a long time, and it irked him that he couldn't place her, not in the way that made sense. The judge cleared his throat and continued with the formalities of the hearing, his voice a little sharper now as he imposed the fine, the standard penalty for a minor violation of this sort. He was firm in his ruling, but his words carried a bit more weight today than they usually did. Something about Olivia made him want to show he was in charge. Her presence seemed to challenge him without her even speaking a word. "A fine of $200 will be imposed," he said with a finality that left no room for argument, "payable within 30 days, or additional penalties may apply." His gavel struck the bench with an authoritative thud, and he leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the ruling. Olivia stood up slowly, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she spoke in a voice that was quiet yet unwavering. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said politely, but her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before she turned and walked out of the courtroom without so much as a glance back. The courtroom remained still for a moment. As everyone processed the exchange, Olivia's composure seemed to linger in the space. Long after she had left, the judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Something about her left him unsettled, but he couldn't quite figure out why. Outside the courtroom, the whispers began almost immediately. The story of the quiet woman in the courtroom who had accepted her fine without protest began circulating like wildfire, and soon it was more than just a small town story. It was being picked up by news outlets across the country. The headlines were simple but charged: "Billionaire woman fined for traffic violation," and suddenly Olivia Carter's name was everywhere. As the news spread, her wealth, her influence, and her role as a successful tech mogul came to light. It seemed almost absurd that someone of her status had been fined for something so trivial, and the public reaction was swift and intense. The questions began to pour in. Why hadn't she argued the fine? Why hadn't she used her position to get out of it? Was she simply trying to avoid the spotlight, or was there something more to this story than met the eye? Judge Turner's name, too, was soon attached to the story, but not in the way he had hoped. The media picked apart his decision to impose the fine, calling into question his assumptions about Olivia's status. His lack of awareness of who she was or what she represented began to paint him as a man out of touch with reality, or perhaps just a man too quick to judge. The local news stations turned their focus to Olivia Carter, running segments on her life, her journey from humble beginnings to tech empire success, her philanthropic work, her impact on the world of business, and beyond. She was no longer just a name on a traffic citation, but a symbol of a much larger conversation about privilege, power, and the assumptions people made based on appearances. Judge Turner was left in the wake of the storm he had stirred, unaware of how much a simple fine could unravel, how quickly the courtroom encounter would transform from a minor legal matter into a topic of national conversation. The news exploded like wildfire, spreading across social media and television screens with an intensity that took everyone by surprise. Olivia Carter, once a name known only to a select few in the business world, was now a household figure. The story of her minor traffic violation and the fine imposed by Judge Samuel Turner had captured the public's attention, but it was the reveal of her true identity that sent shockwaves throughout the country. Within hours, the media outlets had dug deep into Olivia's background. Headlines flooded the front pages, each one more sensational than the last. Asterisk. Billionaire tech mogul fined for traffic violation. Asterisk. Judge finds self-made entrepreneur who revolutionized Silicon Valley. Woe is Olivia Carter, the woman who took the world by storm. As the details of her success emerged, people began to see Olivia in a new light. She was not just a wealthy businesswoman, she was a visionary, the founder of a tech empire valued in the billions, a philanthropist who had donated millions to causes ranging from education to climate change. She was one of the most powerful Black women in the world, admired not only for her business acumen, but for her quiet yet undeniable influence. Judge Turner's courtroom mistake had unwittingly placed Olivia in the spotlight, and now everyone was paying attention. But what surprised many was how Olivia handled the sudden media storm. Despite the frenzy, she maintained her calm, choosing not to lash out at the judge, not to challenge the fine, or make any demands. She didn't need to. Her status had already been established. Instead, she issued a carefully crafted statement, one that was measured and composed, reflecting her true character. "I appreciate the court's decision and respect the legal process," Olivia's statement began. "However, I believe it's important that we have a broader conversation about assumptions and the role of bias in our justice system. This fine, though small, has highlighted the often unseen challenges that people like me face in spaces where we're judged not by our character or accomplishments, but by our appearance. I hope this moment can be a catalyst for change." Her words resonated across social media, sparking a wave of support from people of all walks of life. Many saw her as a symbol of resilience, of someone who had fought through adversity and reached the highest levels of success, only to be reduced to a simple traffic offender in the eyes of the law. Others were quick to point out the irony. How could someone so influential be so overlooked, and how had Judge Turner, who was supposed to uphold justice impartially, failed to see her for who she truly was? The public didn't just mock the judge. They questioned the system that had allowed such an oversight to happen. It was a conversation about privilege, race, and the assumptions that governed interactions in every facet of society. For Judge Turner, the flood of media attention was overwhelming. He had thought the matter would be a simple, routine case, something he could wrap up in minutes. But now his courtroom had become ground zero for a national conversation about racial bias in the legal system. The more he saw Olivia's face on the television screens, the more he realized how wrong he had been, how much he had misjudged her, and how deep the problem of bias ran in his own thinking. Yet, despite the growing public uproar, he remained focused on his duty as a judge. He tried to convince himself that the fine he had imposed was merely a procedural matter, that it was nothing personal. But the truth was, the sting of his mistake gnawed at him. He had taken one glance at Olivia and made assumptions that led to his ruling, a ruling that had now become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. It wasn't just the media that was watching. Behind closed doors, legal professionals began questioning the fairness of his decision. His peers began to wonder if there was more to the story than a simple misjudgment, and whispers of reform in the judicial system began to spread. And Olivia, despite the growing storm around her, did what she always did. She stayed silent, choosing to lead with grace, waiting for the right moment to make her next move. She had already won the battle. Now it was time to win the war. The public's eye was on her, and she knew that her influence could help bring about the change that was needed. But first, she had to let the judge and the world see how the system could evolve. And she knew that, for some, that meant taking a step back and letting them realize their own flaws. As the days passed, the backlash against Judge Samuel Turner grew more intense. The media, which had initially focused on Olivia Carter's impressive achievements, now turned their attention to the judge's decision and the assumptions that had led to it. News outlets, social media platforms, and even late-night talk shows seized on the irony of the situation. A billionaire tech mogul fined for a simple traffic violation, with the judge failing to recognize her true identity. The story quickly became a symbol of larger societal issues: racial bias, class inequality, and the blind spots that too often govern decisions in positions of power. Judge Turner, who had prided himself on his impartiality, found himself the target of public ridicule. His name, once respected in legal circles, was now associated with the humiliation of having missed one of the most obvious truths about Olivia Carter. Commentators discussed his background, questioning his awareness of the world outside the courtroom, and wondered how someone in his position could be so unaware of the influence and prominence of a woman like Olivia. The criticisms ranged from subtle jabs about his lack of cultural awareness to more pointed accusations about his potential racial bias. While some defended Turner, arguing that it was a simple mistake and that judges were under immense pressure to manage the flow of cases quickly, the truth was undeniable. His ruling had exposed a deeper flaw in the system, one that could not be ignored. In a society that often made snap judgments based on outward appearances, Turner's actions highlighted just how deeply ingrained these biases were, even in the legal system. On the other side, Olivia's poised response to the incident only amplified her status. She had kept her focus on the larger issue at hand, avoiding direct confrontation with the judge. Instead, she used her platform to speak out about the unfair assumptions that were made about her based solely on her appearance. She became a voice for people who were often overlooked, for those who found themselves unfairly judged by the systems that were supposed to protect them. Her response resonated with millions. Social media buzzed with discussions about Olivia's poise and her call for reform, and it wasn't long before activists and civil rights groups began to align with her message. They highlighted the systemic nature of the problem, discussing how everyday citizens, particularly people of color, were often subjected to the same kind of superficial judgments that Olivia had faced in the courtroom. The public reaction didn't just stop at social media. Legal scholars and lawyers began to weigh in, discussing the potential impact this case could have on the judicial system. Some argued that it should serve as a wake-up call for the entire legal profession, a reminder that the law should be applied impartially, without prejudice or bias. Others called for more thorough diversity and inclusion training for judges, pointing out that assumptions like the ones made by Judge Turner could have far-reaching consequences for those who didn't have the platform or influence to speak out. Despite the storm swirling around him, Judge Turner continued to hold his ground. He tried to focus on his daily duties, but the pressure was mounting. His colleagues began to avoid discussing the matter with him, and behind closed doors, some of them expressed concerns about his judgment. The tension was palpable as Turner realized the gravity of his mistake, but he struggled with how to fix it. Olivia, for her part, had stayed out of the judge's line of sight. She had made it clear through her statement that the issue was not about the fine itself, but about the assumptions that led to it. She made sure her message didn't get lost in the noise of public opinion, keeping her focus on the systemic problems she hoped to address. Her influence, once confined to the tech world, now spread across industries, as her call for a more inclusive society began to take root. But she wasn't finished yet. While the public was captivated by her grace, Olivia knew that the real work had just begun. It wasn't enough to just speak out. She needed to take action to ensure that the conversations that were unfolding in the media didn't fade away into the background, forgotten after the next news cycle. And so, behind the scenes, Olivia started to take the first steps toward real change. She reached out to advocacy groups, legal experts, and even public policy leaders to begin shaping a plan that could address the biases in the judicial system. Her role in the conversation was shifting from that of a victim of a simple mistake to a key player in a larger movement for reform. Meanwhile, Judge Turner, feeling the weight of his actions, started to question his role in this larger conversation. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he had been a part of the problem rather than the solution. The guilt began to set in, and as the public's attention turned to the larger systemic issues, Turner had to decide whether he would remain stuck in his old ways or take the steps necessary to change. If not for his own sake, then for the sake of the people who depended on the courts to deliver justice without bias. The national conversation about racial bias and the assumptions inherent in the judicial system continued to gain momentum. Olivia Carter's measured response to her fine had sparked not just public outcry, but a widespread call for reform. People from all walks of life, from grassroots activists to legal scholars, were speaking out about the need for change. Olivia had become a symbol of what could go wrong when assumptions were made based on appearance rather than substance, and her involvement in this larger conversation was only growing. Behind the scenes, Olivia was taking concrete steps to turn the conversation into action. She knew that the media frenzy would die down eventually, but the issues she had brought to light, the biases in the legal system, the assumptions made about people based on race and class, were not going to go away on their own. She began quietly meeting with experts in criminal justice reform, reaching out to lawmakers, and working with advocacy groups that focused on racial equity. Olivia was determined to use her platform and influence to push for real, tangible change. She started a foundation focused on criminal justice reform, aimed at addressing systemic inequalities within the legal system. The foundation's first initiative was to support diversity training for law enforcement and judicial figures. Olivia knew that the biases that had influenced Judge Turner's decision were not unique to him. They were part of a larger pattern, one that ran deep within many institutions. It was time for people in positions of power to take a hard look at their assumptions and begin the difficult work of self-reflection. Her efforts were met with both support and resistance. Many people in the legal field welcomed her involvement, seeing it as a much-needed conversation starter. Some judges even publicly acknowledged the need for better training and awareness around implicit bias. But there were also those who felt threatened by the idea of reform, those who saw it as an attack on the very system that had allowed them to rise to power. The pushback was subtle at first, underhanded comments in the media, anonymous op-eds questioning her motivations, but it quickly became clear that some people were not willing to concede that the system needed change. Meanwhile, Judge Turner found himself under intense scrutiny. As the months passed, his name continued to be tied to the controversies surrounding Olivia. He had become a symbol of the outdated, prejudiced mindset that many people were fighting against. It wasn't just the media that was questioning him anymore. Colleagues within the legal profession were starting to challenge his approach, wondering how many other times he had passed judgment without truly considering the full context of a situation. He had become increasingly isolated, his reputation tarnished, his career on the line. The judge had always prided himself on his sense of fairness, his belief that the law should be applied equally to all. But now, in the quiet moments when he reflected on the past year, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that his decision had been driven by something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the law itself. He had seen Olivia as just another wealthy, well-dressed individual in his courtroom, not someone whose accomplishments and status should have warranted a second glance. He had assumed that she was like everyone else who had come before him, that the rules were simply a formality for people like her. It was a realization that weighed heavily on him. Judge Turner had been forced to confront his own biases, his own blind spots. He had spent decades in the courtroom believing that he was above such mistakes, that his position of authority shielded him from the very prejudices that he was supposed to prevent in others. But Olivia's calm demeanor had shattered that illusion, forcing him to face the uncomfortable truth about himself. As the conversation about bias in the judicial system grew louder, Olivia's efforts were gaining traction. The foundation she had started was attracting attention from key influencers in politics and business. She was invited to speak at conferences, to participate in panel discussions, and to meet with legislators about the need for policy changes that would address racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Her influence had reached a tipping point. More and more people were beginning to listen, not just to her story, but to the larger message she was advocating. Olivia wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been unfairly judged, for everyone who had been treated as less than because of their race or socioeconomic background. For Olivia, the path forward was clear. She had been thrust into the spotlight by a simple mistake, but she would use this moment to make a lasting impact. The system had failed her once, but now it was time for her to help fix it, not through grand gestures or confrontational tactics, but through quiet, persistent work that would change the way people saw each other and the way justice was applied. Judge Turner, meanwhile, faced an uncertain future. The storm that had started with a traffic fine had led to an unavoidable reckoning, both for him personally and for the system he represented. Whether he would choose to take responsibility for his actions and become part of the solution or continue to resist change remained to be seen. The ball was now in his court, and it was clear that the consequences of his choices would ripple through far more than just his own career. As the months passed, Olivia Carter's influence in the push for judicial reform continued to grow. The foundation she had established was gaining momentum, drawing attention from across the nation. Her initiatives on implicit bias training for law enforcement and the judiciary were starting to make waves, and many public figures and legal professionals were beginning to take notice. Olivia's approach was calm, methodical, and unyielding. She wasn't looking for confrontation, she was looking for change, and she was willing to be patient to achieve it. Her foundation's work was also expanding beyond training programs. Olivia began working with local governments to implement pilot programs that would test alternative methods for handling minor infractions like traffic violations, methods that focused more on restorative justice rather than punitive measures. These programs emphasized education and rehabilitation, particularly for marginalized communities, rather than relying solely on fines and courtrooms. It was a vision for a more just and equitable system, one that addressed root causes rather than perpetuating cycles of punishment. But Olivia's rise as a reform advocate did not go unnoticed by the establishment. As her profile grew, so did the number of people who opposed her vision. Some critics, particularly those within the legal community, questioned her motives. How could a billionaire who had built her wealth in the tech industry truly understand the intricacies of the legal system? Others saw her activism as a challenge to the status quo, an attempt to destabilize a system they believed was functioning just fine. Yet Olivia remained steadfast in her mission, unbothered by the opposition. She had faced far greater challenges in her life and had come out stronger at each time. Meanwhile, Judge Samuel Turner, the man whose mistake had set this entire chain of events in motion, was wrestling with his own conscience. The media had not forgotten about him. While the attention on Olivia had remained strong, so too had the public scrutiny of his actions. His colleagues, many of whom had initially remained silent, were now beginning to speak out in private, discussing the ramifications of his misjudgment. He had made the mistake of assuming Olivia's worth based on her outward appearance rather than the substance of her character, and that had cost him dearly. Turner's reputation had taken a significant hit. Though he had made an initial attempt to defend his actions by claiming that his ruling was merely procedural, it had become clear to everyone, including his peers, that there was far more at play than simply the law. His judgment had been clouded by preconceived notions and biases, and while he had initially hoped the storm would pass, it hadn't. The calls for change, for more accountability within the judiciary, were growing louder, and many wondered if Turner was part of the problem. The very system he had worked to uphold was now under intense scrutiny, and his own role in perpetuating it could no longer be ignored. But perhaps the most significant shift had come from within Turner himself. Late at night, after long days in court, he found himself reflecting on the consequences of his actions. He had always prided himself on being fair, objective, and impartial. Yet when faced with Olivia Carter, a woman who, at first glance, seemed no different from the many other well-dressed individuals who appeared before him, he had failed to see beyond the surface. He had allowed his assumptions to shape his judgment, and in doing so, he had become a symbol of the very bias he had worked to avoid. For the first time in his career, Turner felt a deep sense of guilt. The notion that his mistake had impacted not only Olivia, but also a broader conversation about justice was not lost on him. And despite the mounting pressure, despite the media spotlight, Judge Turner realized he had to make a choice. He could either resist the wave of reform and continue down the same path, or he could embrace change and acknowledge the flaws within the system. It wasn't an easy decision. His career had been built on the belief that he was a fair and just man, but Turner could no longer ignore the truth. Olivia's message had reached him in ways he hadn't expected. Her call for reform wasn't just about her own experience. It was about the countless others who had suffered because of a system that failed to see them for who they were. Olivia was asking the world, and especially people in positions of power like him, to do better. And the more Turner thought about it, the more he realized that the law was not a static, unchanging entity. It was something that needed to adapt, to evolve, and to reflect the changing times. And so, after much reflection, Turner made a decision. He would not remain silent any longer. In a surprise move, he reached out to Olivia, requesting a private meeting. He wanted to understand her perspective better, to hear directly from the woman whose case had exposed so many flaws in the system. As the news of the potential meeting spread, there was a sense of disbelief among both Olivia's supporters and Judge Turner's colleagues. Would the judge, who had made such a public misstep, now take the brave step of acknowledging his own flaws and seeking dialogue with Olivia? It was an unexpected turn in a story that had captivated the nation, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The meeting between Olivia Carter and Judge Samuel Turner took place in a small private office in a courthouse in the heart of the city. The room was stark, lit by a single overhead lamp, the walls adorned only with official portraits and legal bookshelves. It was the kind of setting that had once felt familiar and comforting to Turner, but today it felt strangely constricting. The weight of his actions and the decision to reach out to Olivia hung heavy in the air. Olivia arrived early, as she always did, composed and calm. Despite the media frenzy that still followed her every move, she was known for her ability to stay focused and keep a level head. She had received the request for a meeting with a mix of curiosity and caution. Her foundation had been at the forefront of the national conversation on judicial reform, and while many people had shown support, she had also faced considerable resistance. She didn't know what to expect from Judge Turner, but she knew that this conversation, if it went well, could be a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight for justice. When Turner entered the room, he seemed smaller than Olivia had imagined. The confidence he once exuded in the courtroom now appeared to be replaced with something less certain, more vulnerable. His usual imposing demeanor had softened, and he looked almost like a man questioning everything he once held true. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice shaky but earnest. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to express my regret for the way I handled your case. I see now that I made a terrible mistake, and I've spent a great deal of time reflecting on it." Olivia nodded slowly, taking in his words. She wasn't here for an apology. What mattered most was what came next. She had spent years fighting for a more just system, and one man's admission of guilt wouldn't be enough to change anything. Still, she appreciated his honesty. "I've heard a lot of people say that you made a mistake, Judge Turner," she said, her voice steady and firm. "But what's more important than the mistake itself is what we do with the knowledge we've gained from it. We can't keep pretending that biases don't exist. You didn't just misjudge me. You misjudged what so many others have experienced in this system. People who don't have the privilege of being seen as important or worthy. You didn't see me for who I am, and you didn't see the countless others who've been treated the same way." Turner shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. He hadn't expected this conversation to be easy, but Olivia's words stung more than he had anticipated. For a moment, there was a silence between them, and Turner couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. But instead of backing down, he found himself driven by a need to understand, to learn from this woman who had turned his world upside down. "I realize that," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time during the conversation. "And that's why I wanted to talk to you. I don't just want to apologize. I want to make amends. I want to be part of the change, not the problem. But I don't know how to start." Olivia leaned forward slightly, her gaze unflinching. "It starts with listening. It starts with understanding that justice isn't something we just dispense in a courtroom. It's something we live by, every day. It's understanding the systems that shape our lives and the biases that we all carry, whether we admit them or not. It's about challenging those systems and not just accepting them because they've been in place for years." Her words were measured, but they hit Turner like a wave crashing against a cliff. He had spent so many years believing that the law was absolute, a set of rules that were meant to be followed without question. But now he was beginning to see the cracks in that belief. The law, as it was not enough. It had to evolve, just as society was evolving. "I understand," Turner said, his voice stronger now. "But how do we make it happen? How do we begin to change something so ingrained in the system?" Olivia smiled slightly, the first sign of warmth she had shown since the meeting began. "It won't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you, people in positions of power who are willing to admit that the system is flawed. It starts with real accountability. Judges, lawmakers, police officers, they all need to be held to higher standards. They need to understand that justice is not blind. It's human, and if we don't recognize that, we'll keep failing people." Turner nodded, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time, he realized that the reform Olivia was advocating for wasn't just about changing the law. It was about changing the way people thought about justice. It was about fostering a deeper, more compassionate understanding of the world and its inequalities. The meeting lasted for more than an hour, with both Olivia and Turner discussing ideas for reform and ways to address the biases that plagued the justice system. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. And when it ended, neither of them had all the answers. But for the first time, there was hope. There was the potential for real change, not just for Olivia's case, but for the entire system. As Olivia left the courthouse that afternoon, she felt the weight of the conversation settle on her shoulders, but it was a weight that felt manageable. Change was coming, slowly but surely. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that even the smallest steps could lead to something much larger. The road ahead would be long, but Olivia Carter had always believed in the power of perseverance. Now, it was time to see where this new partnership could take them. The meeting between Olivia Carter and Judge Samuel Turner had been a pivotal moment, not just for them, but for the ongoing conversation about justice, race, and systemic inequality. It was the beginning of something larger, a collaboration that no one had anticipated. As the months passed, the ripples of their dialogue started to spread, influencing not only the legal community but also wider societal attitudes toward accountability and reform. Olivia's foundation, bolstered by her newfound partnership with Turner, quickly gained traction. Their discussions turned into concrete actions. Turner, once a figure of scorn, began working with Olivia to create new programs aimed at reducing bias in the judiciary. He took the bold step of participating in open seminars where judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers were trained to recognize their biases, with a focus on how unconscious prejudices affected their decisions. The very man who had been responsible for one of the most public examples of bias in recent memory was now becoming an advocate for change. It wasn't easy. There were still people who viewed his actions with skepticism, critics who believed that his involvement was merely an attempt at damage control. However, the sincerity of Turner's efforts spoke for itself. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his reputation, not just by apologizing for his mistakes, but by actively working to ensure that no one else would have to endure what Olivia had faced. Olivia, too, continued her work with unrelenting focus. She used her platform to advocate for broader reforms, including pushing for changes in sentencing laws, advocating for policies that promoted fair treatment across all races and backgrounds, and supporting community-led initiatives to reduce the criminalization of minor offenses. What had started as a personal battle for recognition had transformed into a movement for justice. Her advocacy now touched on everything from education reform to healthcare access, understanding that systemic inequities didn't just exist in the courtroom. They permeated every corner of society. Public support for Olivia's efforts grew, and her foundation became a major force for change. In meetings with legislators, Olivia was able to influence policies that would give voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. The media, once so focused on the drama surrounding her traffic fine, now followed her closely as she worked on groundbreaking initiatives. Olivia was no longer just the woman who had been wronged in a courtroom. She was a force for progress, an influential voice pushing for equality and justice at every level. As for Turner, he faced the challenge of integrating the lessons he had learned into his work. He was often asked how he could justify staying in the same profession that had nearly destroyed his career. His answer was simple: change had to come from within. By being an active part of the reform process, he hoped to set an example for others who might find themselves in a similar position. He was working to make the legal system better, not just for those who had money or influence, but for everyone, especially those who had too long been marginalized. Together, Olivia and Turner began collaborating on new initiatives. They pushed for legislation that would make sentencing more equitable, calling for a reevaluation of mandatory minimum sentences, particularly in non-violent crimes. They championed bail reform, ensuring that individuals who couldn't afford bail were not forced to remain in jail simply because of their financial status. Turner even became a mentor to younger judges, showing them how to approach cases with humility and a recognition that fairness didn't always mean following the letter of the law without considering the larger context. In the public sphere, the story of Olivia Carter and Judge Turner became a powerful symbol of change. It wasn't just about one woman's fight against an unjust system, but about how that fight could lead to tangible reform when people in positions of power recognized their role in perpetuating those systems. Olivia's initial encounter with the judge had opened a door, but it was their shared commitment to addressing the flaws of the legal system that truly created lasting change. Years later, both Olivia and Turner looked back on that moment in the courtroom with a sense of gratitude. What had been an embarrassing mistake for one and a painful reminder of inequality for the other had turned into a defining moment, not just for them, but for the entire nation. Olivia's influence was felt in every corner of the country, while Turner had earned a hard-won respect as someone who had acknowledged his mistakes and used them as a catalyst for reform. Together, they had proven that even the most unlikely partnerships could lead to profound change. And in the end, the true victory was not just the reforms they had pushed for or the policies they had helped change. It was the hope that their story inspired in others. It was a reminder that no matter how small the step, change was possible.